Hello and welcome to Flory Models. A little bit of a special one today. As you can see, it is a glorious, lovely day. Sun is shining and everything. Who would have known after obviously the weather we've been having recently. Anyway, long story short, was contacted by Airfix a few months ago now about a certain press day they want to do, a secret location and all the rest of it. And to be honest with you, normally I don't really do these things because obviously it's a day off work and it's a long poke, because anything obviously a couple of hours I have to stay over the night before, so forth and so on. But this particular one I happen to know all about it, so I know where it was and all the other bits and pieces, and I thought, do you know what, I think it'll be a really nice day. What I didn't know though was Airfix were going to announce it when we're all there. So I've got to be there 9:30, 10 o'clock. It's about just under an hour from here, so it's great. And then they're going to announce what this special thing is today at 10:15 on the internet. So you guys will know just about the same time as we do as well, but hopefully, luckily enough, we'll be there to see it. So it should be quite good. I'm not going to vlog the drive up there because, to be honest, it's only up the road. But what I'll do, I'll take some little bits and pieces as we go. But throughout the day, I'm going to vlog it and everything and get this edited and put together as quick as I can, so forth and so on. All right. So anyway, this is it. And I can't believe the weather, because the weather's been absolutely pants here for the last couple of days. And now it's blue sky, no wind, no nothing. So hopefully, should be a really nice day out. Anyway, time to get on with it.
There you are. So our brand new tool, 1/48 scale Seaking, HAS1, HAS5 and HU5. It's due to hit the shops mid-August, so it is already on its way over to us from India. You'll be pleased to know that you will all walk away with a sample with you today. So crack on, lads. You've got everything you need to talk about it. 348 parts in total, 46 centimetres long and 40 centimetres wide. 4 decal schemes, all of the same aircraft, XV666, which, as you saw there, is still flying as part of the Heli Operations Group. 10 months in design and 9 months of tooling engineering. And as I said, stock due in August. The retail price point would be £55. Everyone happy? No one guessed Seaking yesterday, which we were amazed at, but equally really concerned that no one wanted one. So come on.
Bomb was enough, mate. That's fine.
Yeah. So there's the box art. This is the first livery of XV666. The box size, which actually I forgot, is here. Here you go. That is it. It is full of plastic and decals. I'm going to hand over now to my colleagues Luke and Chris to talk you through the research and development of this product, the tooling and engineering. Some of the slides that you'll see at the beginning are very familiar to some of you, but just bear with us, because shortly after we then go into all the detail and everything of the particular kit. Okay. Thank you, Luke and Chris.
Right. Hi everyone, I'm Luke, the researcher. Some of you might have met me, some haven't. So my job is to, as it says in the title, research the various products we do. I'm going to take you through how we select products, all the way through to how we pick schemes, or what people see as the final thing. So hopefully give you a nice idea of what I do all the time. So I'm going to use the Seaking as my basis for taking you through this, just to give you an insight into some of the challenges we faced during the research and the design stage. So before design, sorry for those that have seen this already, we have to select which product we're going to do. So eventually, spoiler, we ended up with a Seaking, but how did we get there? We have to look at gaps in the market. So I always put Walrus on this slide, things that weren't out there. It's probably the most obvious thing in business. There's a gap, let's fill it. Release schedule, very apt. I haven't changed this slide, but Seaking, I always use the 72nd, and I full well knew it was a bit of an Easter egg for what was coming. Is a great aircraft because it's served for so long and there's so many marks you can tick off. It means that we can release it multiple times and make a bit more money each time. grow ranges. So we always want to complement what's already in the range and potentially grow new ones. So I put Vampire there. It would be of no use if there were no other cold war jets. So you want to be adding to the existing ranges within the catalogue. Rule breakers is a bit of an odd one. I always put Swift there because it's sort of one of those things where you're only going to get one release. In this case, it was an FR5. But I suppose it is a gap in the market. So it ticks one, but maybe not all of the boxes. And it's just one of those where you look at it and go, oh, but it's a great subject, let's do it anyway. We don't get to do that very often. And then previous sales, aircraft notoriety, a Spitfire. I think the comment I saw the most in the lead up to this was, I hope it's not another bloody Spitfire. So it's not, you'll be glad to know. So I start with this. Let's just scale up the 172nd Seaking. How hard can it be? That was the conversation had before my time with Airfix, but I was dealt to pick up the pieces and realise how hard it can be. So I put the two there. The 72nd, unfortunately you can't see it very well on the screen behind, compared to the 48th. Hopefully you see a drastic difference, not only in size but also detail. My predecessor, Simon, who likes to claim this as his idea, he always thought this was something that would be nice and easy to do, and hopefully when you see the Seaking you realise how complex an aircraft it is and how much work's gone in it from our side. So research, we've picked the Seaking because it ticks all the boxes, and we're away. This is where I start. So the first stage is data collection. It sounds pretty sensible. You want to find all the experts you can. We're lucky here that we've got quite a few experts in Seakings, and a couple of the guys have helped with the development of the kit, which we're very grateful for. Finding archive material as well as experts is great. Going to Westlands, Fleet Air Arm Museum, finding either drawings, that's the holy grail, very rarely does that happen, but manuals, photos from the period, they're fantastic. And building a subject library, so making sure you have all the books on the subject and realise that most of the authors have no idea what they're talking about because they all contradict each other, and then work your way through and find out what the facts are. So hopefully at that point you've got a big library and you're sifting through, and then you go to version selection. So the Seaking obviously has lots of versions, and you'll see a few of them today. We thought, essentially, what hadn't we done at 72nd? We'd done the HER3, we'd done the HC4, we probably thought it's time to give the Navy guys a bit of a go. So we stuck with that, starting with a HES1. We thought it'd be really nice to show the origin of the story, really, in British hands, rather than Sikorsky. And we then have to sort of start justifying why we're picking that version. So ease of R&D. It wasn't easy. That's probably the best way of saying that. But making sure that it's possible is a really important thing. You don't want to invest all this time and then at the end go, oh, I can't mould it. So we just won't release anything. Justifying it, so normally that's sort of giving a bit of a history lesson to the guys and telling them why this aircraft is so significant. Future releases, as I said, you always want to make sure you can release it again in various guises. Not that I can tell you if we'll do it with this particular product. And then eventually, this is all in my head, and I need to just blurt it out. So we do a design team briefing. So that's where Chris, in this case, and Martin, my boss, we sit in a room and talk about the project, what we're hoping to achieve. Hopefully at this time they know we're doing a Seaking, but it's going through the finer details, making sure that we know when we want Chris to be done with the project, when we're hoping to hit the market, as I say, what parts are going to be particularly tricky, what the plan of attack is from a research perspective, what information we have on hand. And then I wish my job was done at that point, but it's not. You can do all the research in the world, but as soon as you give it to a designer, they'll have a question. And that's where you have to do further data collection. So you have to go out, take the designer to various places, make sure they see the aircraft. They've got a better idea of the stuff they're missing than I do, because I'm not working that closely with it at the time. Hopefully at this time they've got scan data, so you'll see later we 3D scanned a HC4, thank you very much to Chris, who's disappeared, for arranging that at HMS Sultan, way back when we did the 72nd kit actually. And then further research trips, so places like Chard, which we visited during the development of the kit to take photos, and as you'll see later, sit in a few planes, helicopters, planes, goodness, dirty words here. And then my favourite bit, Chris's least favourite bit, is at this point he's designed it, hopefully, to a decent enough standard where I can check it. And I rip into it, and I make sure there's no rivet uncounted. And Chris goes off me for a few weeks, and hopefully it means that we're back and forth discussing what's possible from a modelling perspective and what would make the most accurate model. And then that sometimes leads to more research, going out finding more helicopters to look at, speak to more experts, to make sure that we're giving you the best model possible. And then I always say, we put scheme selection here at sort of the end now, but it's not always the case. In fact, you want to pick it pretty early on. When I say schemes, the paint scheme. In the case of this model, I'm claiming it's my idea that we said pretty early on, wouldn't it be great to just show one aircraft, one serial, in 4 different marking options, something you don't get to do with your typical Spitfire or other sort of warbirds. A Seaking's been adapted throughout its life, various different marks from the same airframe. Some might say trigger screw, but you know, it is the same serial. You want to make sure that when you're picking a scheme, you've got the right parts in the kit, so that's why it's really important to do it first, so you don't get to the end and go, this scheme is fabulous, but we don't have the parts for it, so we can't do it. And then, hopefully, the model's near the end of that point, but there's various bits we have to do, so talking to the decal designer, doing multiple revisions on the decal sometimes, the artwork, speaking to Adam Tooby, doing multiple revisions on that, and then things like this where you're launching the product, which is probably the most rewarding time because we've had to keep it secret for so long and worry about saying Seaking too many times. And eventually it's released. So here we are now at the end of this timescale. So hopefully that's the end of the repeat slides for people who have seen this presentation before. So we were lucky enough to get a lovely manual from Westland of the HS1, so the very first Seaking. They'd had a go at making their own Airfix kit, but it wasn't quite there, as you can see, so we thought we'd tweak their manual a bit. And this is part of that data collection slide, you see. So we're going out and collecting as much information as we can, and obviously, where better to get than the horse's mouth? See what I did there? Pun intended, where we are. So getting it from the original manuals, people who flew the aircraft, but also going out and visiting the aircraft as well. So you see some interesting cutaways here. The child in me here has shown the P-tube that is fitted there. It was a very important thing me and Chris decided we must include. And also the rotor heads. When you see them later today, you'll realise just how complex they are. And we've had plenty of what my other half would call very boring conversations, what me, Chris and Martin think are very interesting conversations on the complexities of the rotor head. And also the various different parts that change depending on what mark you're doing. So you see the fuel here. That changes depending on Navy to HR3s, HC4s, various things like that. So that's perfect. And then I love this slide because it shows just how far we went for this. So we did something a bit different with this project where it's one of my first as Airfix researcher, although two and a bit years ago now. We'd already had a scan of a HC4 from HMS Sultan, but we were missing some data, so we decided we were going to scan some more aircraft to try and fill some gaps. We ended up scanning 6 of them, just because we could, which is great. Can be a bit confusing at times, making sure you're using the right scan, but we ended up travelling to 6 different destinations, scanning 6 aircraft. We used 10 different organisations for the research of this kit, one of which we're here today, but various others as well. So they're all we're very much grateful for their help. 12 months of research. So we actually sort of relate this to a 24 scale kit in terms of the difficulty of research and design. 348 parts, as you saw earlier. The Spitfire's 433, so there's not a lot of difference in terms of part count. And I'm sure we've all got a few grey hairs as a result of it. And it was a great thing to do, to add up just how many aircraft we visited in the end it was over 35. I mean, for gannets you can't do things like that, where we visited about 4, because that's all there are in the UK. Seakings are everywhere, and it's probably the best time to research something like this. Obviously Spitfires, dime a dozen, not very original. Seakings have only really just left service in the grand scheme of things, so there are plenty around that haven't been touched since then, which means that you can visit lots of different ones and see the changes that took place. And just because I claimed all expenses, 2,000 miles travelled, so it was a lot of hours in the car for this one. You'll see different icons on this map behind. I know it's a bit difficult. Those in blue are Navy Seakings, those in yellow are RAF, and those in green are HC4s that we visited. You can see the one up near Doncaster, that's the South Yorkshire Air Museum, with their HES6 were very helpful. I didn't have to travel to that one. I don't like going too far past Cambridge, really. But yeah, as you can see, it's quite distributed, but generally there are a lot of helicopters down this way. It's almost as if they were made nearby and they've come home to roost. So we've got the ones here, we've got them at Salton, we've also got them at Yeovilton and various places like that. So one place I didn't mention there was heli operations. So down at Portland, the old Portland, there is still a Seaking flying, XV666, the longest continuously serving Seaking. And it's got this fabulous paint scheme. As I say, maybe triggers broom. It's training. It used to train German search and rescue crews, and now it trains other nations. And it was one of our first trips. On the way down here, I believe, we visited Portland to see the actual aircraft. We thought it quite important to go see one that was operational in the HU5 role before heading here. And that gives you a lot of information, not just in terms of external finishes like the rivets you can see near the serial, but also internal information. It's also trying to speak to those that work on it. You gain so much information through speaking to people. And again, that's why Seaking is a great thing to research, because it's only recently retired. There's a lot of living memory around the aircraft, which makes my job easier sometimes. Sometimes it makes it harder, but not in this case. It's very, very nice. It's not all looking at helicopters. Well, it is, but you then get to have a bit of fun with it, sitting in various helicopters. When we arrived here, I believe the engineering team had been struck down with COVID, so we arrived to a very empty charter question at the time, and we were let loose, which was a huge privilege, being able to research and take all sorts of silly pictures, really, in the cockpits, trying not to press any buttons because I didn't want to be responsible for any damage. So looking around, it was serious. It wasn't just looking at these, taking silly pictures. It was, again, looking at the aircraft in infinite detail, really, taking as many photos as you could, being fascinated by the rotor head constantly, and worrying, no, I don't want to go on one of those things. And looking at essentially what is a modern Seaking, which gives you a nice basis to work back from. So I spoke about 3D scanning. This was the bottom scan here is the HC4 from Salton, where they train mechanics for the Navy, essentially. This was scanned way back in, must be 2014 now, so almost 10 years ago. But it gives you very useful data. But the scan at the top there is something different that we've done, and you see there's a few gaps in it. And that's scanned at Salton as well, but only last year, where we realised we'd scanned the HC4, which is great, and the general shape is the same. It doesn't have any sponsons though. And when we say sponsons, these what you might call floats on the side here, where the undercarriage is. It's quite important to get the shape of that right. At 70 seconds, you can use images, and Chris is quite skilled at using images to sort of reverse engineer them and get the shapes pretty much there. But we felt when you're going up to a bigger scale, any mistakes become amplified, shall we say. So it was important to go scan that. Also getting any differences in the Navy aircraft. So one of the big ones is the big lump behind the rotor blade, the radome. And again, you can guess the shape of that, but it's always better to have concrete measurements. and I didn't feel like getting a ladder and getting a tape measure. So we scanned it, which is fantastic. It's filling those gaps. Something we'd not done before. Previously, we'd 3D scanned using an external company, which meant it was a one-shot wonder. You got someone to come out, do it, paid them a lot of money, and they went away and you got one file. We recently brought it in-house, so it means we can scan far more often, and we don't have to do whole aircraft. It's scanning the pieces you need, which in terms of Seaking, there's a lot of different things you need across the versions. So scanning half this aircraft here gets you the sponsons, gets you the radome, but also things like the light underneath and the aerials, those positions that otherwise you'd be guesstimating. I mean, you can get it pretty close, and there's always the old tape measure, taking photos as I'm holding it and Chris is doing the easy bit of taking the photo, but it's more paranoid than that for me. But, so there's the 3D scanning side of it. There are some particular challenges we faced throughout doing the Seaking, and when we chosen to do the Navy one, we obviously wanted to reflect its original role, which was in the anti-submarine warfare role. And the problem is, they kept it secret. A lot of the equipment wasn't photographed very often, so it was a bit of a challenge. The image on the right-hand side, as you look at it, that's from a HES-6, so that was one of the last maps to leave service. But there's some differences between that and HES-5s and HES-1s, where it was upgraded, particularly the monitor on the right-hand side and some other bits. So it was useful for getting crew positions, but it wasn't fantastic for showing the original equipment that was in there. And for that, we had to sort of get a bit creative. You'll see on the table behind, when we go there's a nice cutout from a Westland advert showing the equipment. But they also stole the equipment from the Wessex. So there's a very nice one at Weston-super-Mare, still fitted with the dipping sonar that drops out the bottom of the Seaking. So we use that as a reference, and the HES-6. And also, lovely period photos where we could find them, but they were really hard to come by. I'm sorry, you probably can't see my light. But as I say, one of the big things that we were fascinated by was this rotate and how complex it was, especially when you consider the blade fold. And trying to render it accurately at scale, as Chris will tell you later, is a bit of a nightmare. And also, very simplistically, they're very high up, so trying to get decent photos of them can be hard. Luckily, when we went to Salton down in Gosport, they had a training device, essentially, the top of a rotor head, which meant that we could look at it in a bit more detail. But it still takes a lot of getting your head round with the amount of wires and linkages and various bits going on. I mean, the guys from Historic Helicopters are very used to it, but for us, it's a little maze of a thing. So we used manuals where we could as well to try and get a better understanding, but mainly photographs. There are certain bits of the scan that it can't do. One of those is rotor head. And a bit more on the research side of it. As I say, we filled the gaps with 3D scanning sometimes. So you'll see the radome here, again, is the same as on the HR3 that you'll see later today. For those that don't know what the mark is, the big bright yellow ones. They carry this little thimble radome, and so did the early Navy type Seakings. Again, they stole the equipment from a Wessex. So I was down in Bournemouth for my graduation at the time, so I thought I'll scan one of those, which came in quite helpful. You also see that we scanned the HS6 to give the crew positions, as I was talking about earlier. But this bottom scan here is really quite something. I'll show you in a bit more detail if you want to later. It's only internal, so we didn't scan any of the outside. So what you're seeing along here, if I get out of the way, is the internal structure where the cockpit is. And also the thermal barrier further behind was open slightly, so you see every frame going down the tail. It's really useful for trying to position things like lights, panels within the cabin. It's something we've not done before. Typically, you don't get to scan inside things. I keep using it as an example. Spitfires, they're a bit too small to scan. Seaking's considerably bigger, so you can fit a lot more stuff in there. One of the advantages for this is that we got to get a very dark photo. It's a lot brighter on mine. They get panoramic images. designers, that is. So if the grey data that you saw behind is hard to interpret, shall we say, a bit like you're buying a house, you can do a 3D walk around of the Seaking, which is fantastic for picking out details that, as I say, might not be very clear. And it's something that's quite new to us, and it's helped us, especially in this case where there are so many differences, not just externally but also internally on the Seaking. Critiques, as I say, my favourite bit, Chris's least favourite bit. It's a lot of stuff like this where you're taking photos of aircraft, circling bits and going, where's this bit? Why haven't you got this? And every designer does it. You get so close to a subject that it's, you can't see what's in front of you almost in terms of the detail. They're fantastic at designing the shapes and the detail, but there's just so much on the Seaking, so you need that fresh set of eyes to come back in and identify bits that have changed or need changing. So a lot of that is, I hate rivet counters, can I just put it out there? Although I am one. The job has forced me to become one. So it's things like, you've missed a rivet here, you've missed a row of rivets. Especially on Seakings, aerials, everywhere. Helicopters, they just bolt them on, and I don't like them for that. So it's just going through, especially when you're trying to portray an aircraft from its first ever scheme through its last ever scheme, every modification that took place throughout. You're reliant on pictures, manuals, speaking to the people who implemented those modifications to try and understand the changes it went through, and then also tell Chris to make those parts so that we're not missing anything. So hopefully it's the most comprehensive kit of a Seaking we've ever done. Don't tell us otherwise. And that is sort of where I leave it. So the critiques are continually ongoing. So Chris will be designing for, goodness, how long was it in this case?
9 months.
9 months in this case, and it's a lot of back and forth. The worst thing is to get to the end and then do a huge critique where you have to change a load of stuff. You need this dialogue continually ongoing to get the best result. There are obviously stages, waypoints throughout the process where you're doing bigger reviews, but generally Chris gets very annoyed because I keep peeping over his shoulder and go, that's wrong. But we do like each other at the end. So that's where I leave it for now, before Chris starts designing.
Wonderful. Yes, there will be a little bit of repetition, as we said, because the process isn't that dissimilar for every kit, but I'm going to focus on some different things that were part of the Seaking particularly, so hopefully there'll be some new stuff. As Luke said, we started off with the scan that we used in the 72nd scale model, which it was interesting for me to come back to because I got to design the 72nd scale a couple of years into getting the job. So they're both my little babies. It was kind of nice to come back to it. Probably healthy to have a break in between. I wasn't entirely sick of helicopters, but it was kind of fun to come back and see it again in so much more detail. So I went back to this old scan and my old data and I got to critique what I did 8 years ago and figure out, I wouldn't have done that again. I was rubbish back then, wasn't I? Or that was actually quite a clever idea. I wonder why I've got more done. It was an interesting process to do that again. So the scans, some parts, shame you can't see it so well, some parts are brilliant. You can see when you're up close to the scan, these areas show you the overlapping panels and all the rivets and lines and like that. You can get some amazing detail on these scans. But there are other areas where the lasers have just bounced around too much and it just comes back as a real mess. And the rotor hub being one of those places that was just a real mess, which was a shame because it was an area which I would have loved, really clear, easy to understand information, and it just didn't give it to me. But all of the really lovely surface textures, that was great. And as Luke mentioned, I think what made this one of my favourite projects that I've ever worked on. To be honest, maybe I shouldn't say this, but more than the Spitfire, this was a far more enjoyable experience. And I think part of that was actually, I don't want him to hear, but was having Luke around. Yeah, it's going to give him a big head. But because of the amount of information that he was able to gather and bring and put on the table in front of me, I was like, my goodness, this is making my job so much easier. But also that he is now doing the scans himself, and getting these interior scans is a first. I've never worked on a project with information like that before. And it was amazing to be able to, I think I did a relatively good job without them, but putting it in, you'd be like, oh, I got that right, or I need to nudge that by 0.2 of a millimetre, now it's exactly right. It's kind of those extra level of confidence that I managed to get because of these interior scans that he was bringing. So like the other projects, for this one we started, you take the scan, but that CAD data, I think there's a couple of people here use CAD, know about curated design, yeah? There's a few people who kind of know that, but maybe some who don't. The kind of data you get from a scan is not useful for then tooling something from. It's like a cloud point, so you get loads and loads of little points and it's triangulated those shapes and it's really rough and messy, and if you try to make some plastic parts out of that, it'd be rubbish. So we have to totally recreate the data, but we use the scan exactly like a trace. So we can cut it in half, like here, all the way along in these sections, all these like segments that are where the real bulkheads are, and use those and just trace it like a dot to dot. There are areas, you probably can't see it very well, but I have to like imagine where it was underneath the sort of the cowlings taking up the engine, or taking up the gearbox rather. I needed to imagine what the continuous shape was, so there's some little playing around still to build up these 3D shapes that I want. And eventually you end up something like here, you kind of get this mottling effect where they are kind of, the perfect nature of the CAD and the real life nature of an aircraft that's flown a lot aren't the same. The real thing's been battered, moved around, it's had a hard life. And so there is this little mottling effect you get between the scan and our data, but when that's close enough, you've got it bang on. We also have all the areas that I want to split up and all the extra little bits of detail on there that have been taken from the scan, but also taken from the other research, the drawings that Luke has provided. Take that information that you use in the skeleton model, which is just kind of quite blocky, simple shapes, and then begin to cut them up into the parts that will eventually be the parts that we mould. And we do it like this so that if I want to make a change when Luke's given us his critique, be like, oh, I've put that split in slightly the wrong place, I can now move that in the skeleton model, and it updates all the parts accordingly, and ideally everything works perfectly and you get no errors, and that happens maybe 1 in 10. But still, when it does happen, it's a great day. It's good, I go get myself a donut. And we do this on repeat for every part. It's quite a slow process. Again, we're banging on about the roadhead, but it was fascinating. I had to try to get my head around how to design it. I watched a lot of YouTube videos and read a lot of stuff to just figure out what is going on here. What are all these linkages about? What does what job? How many ways does these blades move? So that I could decipher the pile of bits and wires and linkages. And it was fascinating. It's just an incredible piece of engineering. They really are. And so while that was complicated, the bonus of them is that they're repeated 5 times, sorry on this, and we have a pattern tool, so I did it once, copied it 5 times, and it's a really good day. You feel like, oh, I've done a lot today, that's been great. I can leave early, surely. It's not the case. So we've got to do that, but then obviously we've got this folding rotor blades, which made it a little bit more complicated, trying to figure out the angles of that. But it was a really satisfying part of the whole kit to do. Normally you don't have such exposed, complicated details really prominent on a kit. So it was quite fascinating. Something new to work on. Something different with the Seaking that I hadn't really done on any other kit before. We wanted to get a lot of detail on it. It is it's covered in rivets, and they're really prominent rivets and panel lines. But I was a bit nervous that if we'd done our regular kind of style of panel lines, it would all look too much. Filling it with rivets and these deep panel, it might just be too busy and not look right for the scale. Might be fine in 24th perhaps, but 48, you're still balancing. The fineness of the detail is, not as fine as it is in real life. It's a very tiny thing. So instead of doing regular panel lines, I decided to do these overlapping panels. So every join is overlapped, the surfaces are offset by about 0.15 millimeters, which wasn't the easiest thing to do. I kind of knew going into it this was going to be complicated, and it was. And so you start with, maybe you can come and see these on the screen later. We start with the smooth surface that I got from the skeleton model, Well, actually, I'm going to take you through this a little bit more detail in the next slide, and then the rivets afterwards. There we go. So we start with the smooth kind of surface, and then for every time I wanted to do an overlap panel, I had to cut a section out, rebuild it with its little offset of that 0.15 millimeter, and then solidify it again. And so it ended up with this thing that looked like a real patchwork quilt of every time I cut a hole out and added a new join. And when you got 3 panels all overlapping each other in different places, it took quite a lot of my walks home was like, right, how am I going to do that tomorrow? I could do it this way, I could do it that way, which bit goes up, which bit goes down to give the effect. In the end, you can't tell the difference of what's going up or down, but had to really try and figure that out in the process. But I'm very happy with how it turned out. It was a little bit nerve-wracking getting the first set of shots. You're like, is any of this going to show? Is it like, how's that going to come out? And was very relieved in the end. The other thing that we tried differently in this was actually one of Paramjit's ideas, and he decided he'd trial it on me, which was using, when I did the Spitfire, 24 scale Spitfire, after adding all of those rivets onto the file, it made it incredibly slow. Like the computer just couldn't handle it. It's this enormous file of like 1.5 gigs, the bottom wing part. It's so much data on there. It was an absolute nightmare to work with because every time you clicked, you had to wait a few seconds, which doesn't sound long, but it feels properly long when you're clicking a few hundred times, and each time it's like, come on. So instead of putting all of that rivet data into the part, we decided to put it into a separate part. I don't know how interesting this is for any of you, but it was really interesting for me, the massive CAD geek. And it was Paramjit's idea, and I thought it's not going to work. We'll end up with these circular references, and the whole thing's going to fall apart because you're like taking data from here, putting it here, and putting it back into there. Surely that's going to fail. And he said, "No, I reckon it will work, Chris. You try it." And thankfully, amazingly, it did. I was able to take some of the basic data, fill this extra file with all the rivets, just thousands of them. I did add it up, and I've forgotten, but yeah, and the tens of thousands amount of rivets across this thing. And then copied that data back in to the original part and then just solidified it. So ended up with these weird looking, I don't know if you remember those, what are they kind of things? You could put like loads of little nails and you like put your hand into it. It kind of looked like that, the kit, for a little while, like I could just push my hand into these nails. Maybe that's what it felt like. But happy with the finish. And it meant if I needed to make a change to the rivets, I could do it in this much quicker file, make those changes, and everything would update. And it made my life a lot easier. So yeah, not so bad about going back to those sorts of things again. Here is talking about getting the Sponson scan. This is actually just me showing off. This top one is the 72nd scale, where I had no scan data, just some photos and a bad drawing. And this bottom one is how I made some little edits on the 48, but I don't think you can really tell. Can you tell? There's a very slight change here at the back where it actually is a little bit higher for longer. But I was pretty proud of 2 years into the job, Chris. It's like you did all right without a scan. But it was kind of reassuring to get the scan eventually. I'm like, okay, there's a little bit of a tweak. We can get this really spot on perfect. Probably no one's going to tell. But it's really reassuring for us, and it kind of feels nice to know that we've gone to that level of detail. A little bit like for the 24 Spitfire, we didn't use any scans for that because there is so much data out there. There's so many drawings, so much information, and it was over lockdown, so it's hard to get anywhere. But right at the end of the project, Luke had got a scan of a Mark 9, and we're like, do we risk it? How upset will I be? And we put them over the top of each other, and it was a good day. I was like, my goodness, this has worked. It matches perfectly. I'm very happy. But it was a bit of, do I want to look? Do I want to open my eyes? So we still have it in us. It's when the new designers come and they want to oh, you've not got a scan for this. No, you don't need a scan. Do it the old-fashioned way. Just get some photos and figure it out. The eye can do an amazing job of figuring out 3D stuff. It really can. So the comparison between the 72nd and the 48. So this took 5 months in design. The 72nd one, that is, 6 months in tooling, was 130 parts. And it's very simple detailing. It's just, I don't know if anyone's built it. It's very simple on the outside, but it is what it is. It's a 72nd scale model. This one took twice as long to design. It would have been quicker if we didn't have a loop, but it also wouldn't have been right. You know, we would have done what I thought was right with a very different set of eyes, and it missed out a bunch of stuff. He kept me honest, made sure we got it all right. Took 9 months in tooling, a lot back and forth, and 300 and a half parts, like a lot more bits going in there. And a lot of those are very tiny little, you know, all the aerials and things, but wanted to make sure we could represent these things accurately. And finally, the most important check, is it to scale? I do still have the, Malcolm very kindly sent me a big biro with written for scale reference only, which I meant to bring, and it's by my front door, so very sorry about that. So I always have that on my desk. This is just a little check that we have. We've CAD'd up a big biro in our CAD software, because sometimes you can get like too into the CAD and you forget what scale you're working at, and you can start making stuff ridiculously tiny, and it's just stupid. And so having this in there, you scan out, and suddenly like your brain clocks like, oh, it's that big, because I know intuitively, you know, we all know how big a pen is. It just really helps to get yourself back into the real world and realise I don't need to be spending this long on this thing that is, you know, 1/10 of a millimetre long. It's never going to come out in real life. A little bit of fun, but it genuinely helps. It seems silly, but it is actually a useful check. So once we've done all that design, the 10 months of all the little checks, all the details, all the rivets, we get a prototype done, which you've all kind of mostly seen before, and I haven't put it in here because I forgot to take any pictures of it. So we get the prototype made, build that up, make a few edits again, and then go into tooling. This one, like a lot of our bigger scale stuff, one of the challenges is making it all fit in the box and making the build process enjoyable, so trying to get all the parts in a nice kind of order, you're not jumping between a whole bunch of different sprues. And that is a long job of going through this tool plan and thinking about the build sequence at this point already, like what order you're going to put it together in as much as we can. And send it off to our tool makers in China, who do a brilliant job of putting it together, like giving us a layout, trying to learn about, you know, I've been learning a bunch of stuff from having the guys at Plastech, a little bit easier conversation, who've been sort of teaching us some things from the Spitfire, like, oh, that would have actually been helpful if the tool was like this, or look out for this stuff. So always learning, always getting better at understanding these processes. Even 10 years in, I'm still learning a bunch of stuff, because, you know, I'm not I don't make injection molds as my job. I've designed the bits, and so it's still, there's a lot of learning to always be done. So yeah, always, like, every day's a school day, always learning something. These are some pictures of the mold being made, which I always find fascinating. I love the process. The kind of the initial just milling out the kind of key shapes here. You can see the core parts of the fuselage up there, and then they do the electro EDM. Can't remember what the D stands for, but spark erosion. So you get a bit of copper, and you finally put on the details into that bit of copper, because it's softer metal. It's easier to put in the tiny details than it is to a big hard bit of steel. You can't mill such tiny things in the steel because your drills will break. But you can mill that into a bit of soft copper. And then you put an incredibly high voltage bit of current through that bit of copper, and it sparks away the steel and gets those tiny little rivets and details out of steel by using electricity. It's amazing. And then those bits of copper are useless at the end of it. All of that detail has been eroded off the copper and is now, in a way, imprinted into the steel. So it's a slow and expensive process, and the more rivets, the more details we have, the smaller the copper electrodes have to be, because you need to use finer current to run through those. You know, if you use too high a current, it blows bigger holes into the steel, and you don't get as fine rivets. So if you want finer rivets, you need to use smaller bits of copper, where you can use more controlled amounts of electricity to get you the finer details. And each of those is like positioned by hand and then maneuvered with the incredible, like very, very fine work. Yes, they are great things to see.
This is all done in China, is it?
Sorry? That's all done in China. Yeah, that's all done in China. Once we get the shots back, our first set of shots, is a very exciting day, like first time in plastic. I'll spend a week or 2, 3 weeks or so building up these shots and trying to find all the little issues. You know, going from something that is sort of not real in the computer, that it is like in a way perfect, to something that's in real life and is no longer perfect because it's real now, you know. There are always these little issues. There's little changes of tolerances, little stuff that's not quite in the right place. And so I build it up and make all these corrections, and they edit the tool and create these long spreadsheets of all the things that I found, maybe a little bit short, maybe a little bit of sink, maybe this fit is too tight, too loose. Yes, it takes a long old time. It is, to be honest, the most boring part of the whole job, because I've got to be so pernickety and measure everything and try and ask them exactly what to do. And so here, like just these little boxes that sit on the front, they're a little bit loose, so I've got some very thin plastic card, stick that on and be like, okay, it needs 0.2 millimeters added here. And that little, sticking the little thin bits of card just reassure me how much is missing. Send that information back, and they mill a little bit out of the tool, or weld a bit on and mill it again, and make it exactly what it is, which is why that process took 8 months, or so, whatever it was, because there's this back and forth. We'll do this several times over to get it as spot on as possible. And sometimes there are little funny issues that have come back. You can see it too well, but here's one of the control panels, and this is what it should look like. And for them, all of the little dials and knobs were shifted over by a millimetre. How they managed to line up that copper electrode just in the wrong place, like, it was comical almost. But it's so frustrating for them because they have to weld that bit back up because they need to cut more steel out. Sometimes silly things like that happen. Often it's not as dramatic as that, but I thought this is a nice easy one to see where an error came up during the design, during the moulding process. We catch it, go back like it's not good enough, you need to start that part again and get it right. Often it's a lot finer than that, it's just you've missed out a little dot here and you need to add that, but a little bit more obvious to see. And there are other issues, again it's like nitty details, but here the ejector pin is chamfered to try and match the surface of the part, but that ejector pin is being put in at 90 degrees in the wrong way, and so that chamfer is now going on the wrong way under the ejector pin. I don't know if you can see there, it's like sticking up and is now causing a fit issue. So there's so many elements to a plastic kit and those tools. It's such a complicated bit of hardware. And we've got to try and inspect every little detail of it. So right now you need to move that, twist it a little bit, take off 2.2 mil or something. It's a long process, but hopefully it is all worthwhile at the end. And here are just some built up test shots, seeing some of that interior detail. This is one of the things I enjoy with this kit, and hopefully you'll enjoy building it, is all the interior parts. You know, there aren't many subjects we get to do that have such a large space inside and filled with different bits of hardware, and they're just built up as all these little sub-assemblies. And it kind of looks lovely, these little things you've built up on your desk, and you can paint each one individually, almost like don't want to put them in and hide them. And so for the winch assembly for the dipping sonar is one of those little things that was really fun little mini model to get to build inside the main model. I really enjoyed that. It was one of the first things I put together when we got the 3D print. It's actually more exciting than the rest of it. I don't know what it is, but like, this is really fun. I made a little winch. It's cool. So yeah, but it's hard to see once it's built up, but hopefully when you get to do it, you'll enjoy that. And even if you don't do a mark with that in, you can still build it on its own separately anyway, just because it's fun. Well, I think it's fun. You might not. And to finish here, just some glamour shots of it rendered up. So it might be easy to see on the screen later. Just filled with detail. Every panel, every instrument, TVs, what will look like TV screens. Yes. The cockpit was just so many little dials and knobs to do. But thankfully I had a Luke to tell me what was the right things to do for which mark. That's the challenge I have, is like forget which one I'm supposed to be doing and find a picture. I'm like, oh, it looks like that now. Like, Luke, that's not the right one, Chris. Put it away. But I'm very grateful to have him around. There we are. So we have a bunch out on the tables at the back. Luke's just going to go through why we chose the schemes that we did. But you'll be able to go and have a look at all the parts very soon. So if I hand back over to Luke. Yes, you can hear me.
Towards the end of the sort of development, you start to go through the decal schemes. In this case, we picked it. As I say, I've claimed the idea of showing one aircraft throughout its whole life as my idea. Martin wasn't too sure, but I'm going to claim it. It's a really nice thing to do. As you see there, you've got HES1, as you see there. you'll have to believe me. It says HES1, HES5, HU5, but it's all one airframe. So it's just, as I say, triggers broom. Lovely image behind me. So showing 666 not too long ago, flying over Durdledor, not too far from here. Doing its job as it has done for over 50 years now, in various roles. So the first scheme, as I say, we were really keen to show an early Seaking, one of the original sort of batches almost, and also show the last one. Trying to find photos of original Seakings in HS1, guys. They're around, but it's not like someone was doing a photo walk around for Brick Modeler in 1970. So you have to do a bit of digging, and sometimes you have to make an educated guess on what's on the other side of the aircraft you're not being shown, depending on the photo. We were lucky with 666 that pretty soon after entering service, it went to the Farmer Air Show. So there was some chap that's taken photos of it in 1970 that's very much helps this kit in the development. And it showed off quite a bit of detail. There were about 3 photos that we were able to base it off of. This was when it based on Eagle at the time. And it first flew in August 1970 with the squadron, 826 Naval Air Squadron. And obviously HES1 is where the story starts, with the anti-submarine capability, the dipping sonar. But also you'll notice the very early ones, just an interesting fact for you, had green tops of the blades compared to the grey and the black you're used to seeing now. Very dark green. We were very lucky to get some information on the blades from various sources that showed the various paints that have been used, and that's the level of detail we were having to go into. I'm glad that I had that drawing, otherwise I would never have known. They look black. Obviously they're up high most of the time in various different lighting levels, so I really felt like I'd earned my crust that day when I found out they had green tops of the blades. So when we're doing decal schemes, there's, as I say, a lot of back and forth. So we've come up with these ideas, and a bit like the designer critiques, I then send it off to an external guy, Jonathan Mock in this case, who's doing the Seakings. And it's a lot of dialogue, especially where you've got so many aerials changing across the 4 layouts. We've been dealing with it for 1.5 years at this point. Jonathan's given it one day and you're going, right, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And it's a lot to get your head round. And I'm sure when you start looking at the models, you just realise how many things change across the various schemes. There was a lot of digging into those photos from Farnborough, and sort of using other photos of HS1s to fill any gaps that were apparent. You're always conscious that if you're using another airframe to fill gaps onto the scheme you're using, that it might not be correct. So there's a lot of digging goes into that. And you're trying to pick the right time period as well. Even though it's HS1 and they weren't around for decades, they were only around for sort of 5-6 years before they became HS2s and onwards. You want to make sure you're picking one from the same squadron at the same time period, so you can be as accurate as possible. And I think within the team we were really keen to get this, navy colour as we call it, rather than the HU5s you see with grey and red, which are fantastic, but it really does tell the story going from this older sort of thing, seeing them on the deck of Ark Royal, for example, through to seeing them in the skies today. So Scheme 2, Shock Horror, XV666. Damien, as it's also called, I don't think I've said that. The Antichrist, obviously, which is just a fantastic thing. And the B scheme is really intriguing, and it's been a real struggle actually. There's one photo of it, we believe at Portland, without its winch fitted. So you'll see in the instructions we've told people not to fit the winch. So it's probably just come out of repaint, possibly. And the problem with telling the difference between HES5, which is helicopter anti-submarine, and HU5, the utility role, air rescue as you may call it, is that you can't tell what's inside unless you get a video walk around. There were certain telltale signs, so if it had what is called the SAR step, so this little step, a bit like HC4s have a big step by the cargo door, that's had a small one. This one did have that little step, so we believe it might have been a HC5 or just in the beginnings of the conversion. But again, we can't tell what was inside. So we labelled it as a HS5. We also had the dilemma that we have all the parts for this HES5 internally. We need to show the model how to build them. So we put a little note on there saying, we weren't sure, hopefully you guys are, but also showing we've built it as a HS5 inside. Just depending on what you want to do, you can make your decision there. So it's a bit of an intriguing one, trying to work out what it was. You know, you're working on very limited information for this. And that's the problem with showing one aircraft throughout its life. You're reliant on there being a stream of photos throughout its life. You know, you'll find aircraft generally, there might be one photo at the start, one photo at the end. There might be one in the middle. Luckily, we had a photo of 666 all the way through its life in various schemes. So this was where I was trying to understand it a bit more. The C scheme is one that you'd be familiar with. You might have seen it doing demonstrations, air shows years ago. I know this is the scheme I'm most familiar with because of my age, watching it do demonstrations over at Folkestone. It's East Kent for those that don't know where we've come from today. And this one actually is relevant because last week we were at RIAT, and we based the scheme off of the time it appeared at EAT, as it was called at the time. There was no R. 1995 when it appeared there, or 1990 as I'm just reading there. So one thing we were really keen to show was that it did evolve. So there are two HU5 schemes in the kit, and this is where you're getting really nerdy, and you know that's why I get paid, I suppose. We wanted to make sure that it wasn't just a change of colour when you went from this scheme to the Heliop scheme. It was also a change of parts, showing the evolution in terms of aerial fit that happened over those 2 to 3 decades. You know, it didn't just stay the same helicopter. So it was a lot of looking at these photos and realising that it still had a very early aerial fit, very akin to a HAS5, whereas the D scheme was a lot more modern with SATCOM and various other aerials added. And you know, this is what a lot of people who were in danger would have seen, and that's why I think the Seaking is so important to people, whether it be bright yellow or in these colours, doing that job that people sort of look up to as, you know, it's where you could see the armed forces taking action to save those in peril.
Or used to.
Or used to.
Yeah.
Bristows now. And then the D scheme. So, as I say, heli operations, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, they were kind enough to let us visit 666. Again, another perk that we often don't get to do is visit the actual aircraft that we'd be portraying at the end. You know, if you think back to Spitfires once again, you know, if you're picking a scheme, Johnny Johnson's Spitfire, for example, we can't go visit EM 398. But in this case, we could with 666, which is a real privilege. And I think we both felt that going down to Portland at the time. And also, you know, there's the child in you that just likes helicopters and playing with big boys' toys. So there was a bit of that. Yeah, so it's quite a privilege to have gone and seen these. And obviously with what they're doing now, it's even better. So the D scheme is that final chapter. Hopefully not the final chapter, I do say in one of the videos. Hopefully it keeps flying for a long time more. But as you know, it's 50 plus years old at this point. They are ageing airframes. And you would probably say it's one of its last roles it will undertake. So it's, from a boxing point of view, hopefully we're showing first to last in that regard, but I'd like to see it fly for a lot longer. And then there's a bit of a view of the Seaking artwork, which, if you're looking at my screen, is lovely and vivid. Not so much behind me, but this was a bit of a saying to Adam Tooby, who did the artwork. We're really keen to show it at home, so it needs to be, shockingly, over the sea. That was the first thing we said. But also, what scheme do you pick? Do you pick the first or the last? And generally, we don't show civilian schemes on the box, because people's association with the Seaking is that it's a military helicopter. So we felt it should be that first chapter, flying over a lighthouse somewhere in Cornwall or Wales. I can't remember what I briefed all that time ago. And as I say, it's a big dialogue artwork as well. You feel like you're ever closer, and you're getting there. You've done the decal schemes, and you've briefed Adam, but it's a lot of back and forth, making sure that, you know, the aerials are in the right place. So you're trying to remember a year ago at this point. The lights are on the right side in this case. They were not, so we had to do a bit of changing there, and make sure the right equipment's being used, which is great fun. It's that critiquing again. As I say, this job has turned me into a rivet counter, which is not too bad. The great thing with the HS1 is that it's that early shape. Before it starts to get cluttered with aerials, it was very, you will look at the hull, for example, is the best place, just under the nose. It's very clean compared to later examples, where it starts to become a bit bulky and potentially a bit ugly, depending on who you're talking to. I don't think they could ever be ugly, but also, there's no filter door, no barn door filter as they call it, or air particulate box that goes on the top, so you just see the intakes, which gives it a really different look to some of the others. With that thimble radome as well, rather than the, forget what we called it in the end, the flat top radome, round probably. We get very technical in the Airfix office with these sorts of things. Sticky out bits, round bits. Sometimes you just don't know the name of the part, so you just need to give it a recognisable name. Sometimes the designers make that mistake.
I rarely know the name of the part until Luke looks and like, Chris, we know what that's called, Chris. I'm like, do we?
One of the designers recently decided to call them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then realised he might not be able to recognise what those parts are based on the number, unless he's some sort of savant. So there's the artwork there, and as I say, later we can look at it in a bit more detail, as I realise it's a bit washed out there.